Many monarchs throughout the ages have gained notoriety for their height, as if they were chosen, ordained by the hands of some god to rule above and over mankind. There is certainly a correlation between height and leadership in human psychology, not to mention the immense strength being a giant could grant you in the throes of battle. Of those who are historically verifiable, we have Edward IV of England, who is nearly 6'5", which was a giant for his time and place and still an NBA point guard by today's standard. Next up is the double World War reigning King Christian X of Denmark. And fun fact, only King of Iceland. He was 6'7". During Nazi occupation, his powerful figure rode through the streets of Copenhagen alone, without anyone accompanying him or protecting him. Peter the Great, the creator of the Russian Empire, was 6'8" and filled every inch of it. He is widely considered one of the greatest monarchs of all time. King Mutara III of Rwanda was 6'9" and the tallest king ever to be photographed. Dušan the Mighty, the creator of the Serbian Empire, was recorded by multiple sources, and his bones, at 7 feet tall plus some. Recorded as the tallest living man in his day, which doesn't mean he was the tallest person in the world at that time, but it can certainly put him in contention. Among these famous names, the tallest and mightiest among them is someone you've likely never heard of, but his story is anything but boring. The tallest recorded, emphasis on the recorded, king in history is Sancho the Strong. Based on measurements of his femur bone made by Louis Del Campo, he is recorded at somewhere around a whopping 7'3". Ironically, he was the ruler of a tiny nation that at this point had been smashed between France and Spain for the last 300 years, the Kingdom of Navarre. The story of Sancho Jimenez VII of Navarre starts in 1157. He was the firstborn child of King Sancho the Wise of Navarre and Princess Sancha of Castile and Leon. He was the eldest of 6 siblings, although only the older half of these siblings would live past childhood. His 2 younger sisters, who were named Berengaria and Blanche. Not much is recorded regarding the early years of Sancho the Strong, even as he grew into his 7'3" beastly frame. His personality, by all accounts, grew in equal proportions. He was a bit of a jolly giant. To answer the question, I'm sure some of you are thinking, yes, royal inbreeding can cause gigantism. But the House of Jimenez was not as purely bred as most, meaning that this particular case of gigantism in an Iberian world of 5'3" on average men was by random occurrence. The earliest mention we have of Sancho past his own birth is a claim that the Navarrese royal family met Eleanor of Aquitaine and at least one of her sons, King Richard the Lionheart. Just to mention, Richard the Lionheart has been reported as 6'5", but this cannot be verified for his remains have been lost. I can only imagine a scene where these 2 adolescent princely giants got into a friendly sparring match and earned each other's respect with every powerful strike of their sword. The reign of Sancho VI was a much-needed one for Navarre. He restored his nation's borders, which had been invaded and pillaged by French and Spanish alike. He was also the first king to officially drop the title of King of Pamplona and replace it with that of Navarre. Before, these titles were pretty much interchangeable, but Pamplona was only a city while Navarre was the whole region. As Sancho the Strong grew and grew, the last Jimenez family all stayed together in Navarre. The eldest daughter, Berengaria, was even given lands in the north of Navarre in 1185 that would act as a particularly valuable dowry for some. In the year of 1191, a familiar face showed up in the Navarrese court, Eleanor of Aquitaine, the now widowed Queen of England. She only returned to take Berengaria with her so that she could marry her own son, the now King Richard of England. Tiny Navarre now had what was at this point one of the most powerful political marriages in the entire world. This begs the question, why didn't Richard come get his bride-to-be himself? Well, he was already on his way to face Saladin in the Third Crusade. Berengaria accompanied the Aquitanian retinue all the way to Sicily, where she joined the company of King Richard's sister, Joanne. From here, the soon-to-be sister-in-laws traveled to the Holy Land, but on their way, a storm came through, and they were forced to make an emergency landing on the island of Cyprus. The independent Byzantine ruler of the island, Isaac Komnenos, had only recently claimed Cyprus as his own, after being imprisoned by Thoros the Great of Cilicia and Armenia. Isaac Komnenos attempted to arrest the two royals, but the Crusaders accompanying them fended off the attack on their ships. Richard, who was nearby on the island of Rhodes at this point, did the stereotypical romantic chivalric thing and saved his fiancée. After Richard just conquered the island of Cyprus, the pair finally enjoyed their long-awaited wedding. The new Queen of England accompanied Richard to the Holy Land, but left for Europe before the infamous confrontation between her husband and Saladin. Interestingly enough, Berengaria is the only Queen of England to not step foot in the British Isles while she was queen, although she is believed to have visited much later in life. When Richard was making his own return, he was captured and held for ransom by the Duke of Austria. Now that the crusade was over and the English Lion could no longer challenge him, King Philip II of France began taking Angevin possessions in France, including around Aquitaine and Gascony, directly bordering the gigantic in-laws of the Lionheart. Prince Sancho, in what seems to be his first taste of combat, donned his chain mail, gathered the Knights of Navarre and besieged the closest castle that the French had taken. This small but well-equipped force managed to fend off defender sallies for months before Richard was released and arrived on scene, only to find his big brother-in-law and friend had done the brunt of the work for him. The pair reunited, but only for a few days, as bad news came from the Pyrenees. King Sancho the Wise died at the age of 62. Sancho the Strong was now the only male member of the Jimenez royal family and the sole inheritor of Navarre. The two giant kings likely never saw each other again. On August 15th of 1194, King Sancho VII was crowned in the Cathedral of Pamplona. Not even a year later, the untested 37-year-old monarch would face his first challenge. In 1195, the Almohad Caliphate invaded the Kingdom of Castile. King Alfonso VIII called on his allies from Navarre and Leon. Both kings answered these summons, but by the time they arrived from the north, it was already too late. The Castilian army was left outnumbered, and then annihilated at the Battle of Alarcos. King Alfonso blamed the late arrival of his allies for his loss. The alliance with both was thereafter broken. In a preemptive move, the kings of Leon and Navarre attacked their erstwhile ally. Sancho VII and his knights razed the countryside directly south of him and all the way to Almazan. The recently defeated King Alfonso had no choice but to call a truce with his two much smaller neighbors. Not taking any land, merely the valuables of said land, King Sancho returned from his preemptive strike on the local superpower. But when one alliance dies, more await. The wealthy Count of nearby Toulouse, Raymond VI, sent his daughter, Constance, to marry the King of Navarre. This move represented a trend in the life of Sancho VII and his predecessor. They were more focused on everywhere else but the Iberian Peninsula, in contrast to their ancestors who were kings over all of Christian Iberia at one point. In 1197, with help in the form of the Almohad Caliphate, the kings of Leon and Navarre all attacked Castile, more intent on conquest this time. For collaborating with the infidels, Sancho VII and his counterpart in Leon both earned themselves an excommunication from Pope Celestine III. To get the Almohads out of the war, King Alfonso and Caliph Al-Mansur came to a 10-year peace treaty with each other. That's fine, Leon and Navarre were still powerful enough to put up a fight. Oh wait, the King of Leon just married the daughter of the Castilian king and they got unexcommunicated by Pope Innocent III, thereby piecing out of the war and leaving Navarre alone? Oh wait, Aragon just joined the side of Castile and utterly sandwiched Navarre with an invasion? And now King Sancho's only ally, who would do a damn thing, King Richard the Lionheart, was dead and their alliance was yet to be confirmed by the newly crowned King John? Everything was just going so good. The only way to outlast his opponents now was to get another ally. Sancho the Strong elected to go north again. This time, the youngest of the Jimenez brood, Princess Blanche, traveled nearly to Paris, where she joined one of the most refined medieval courts, in the form of the powerful and popular County of Champagne. Her marriage to Count Theobald III would come just before he was elected leader of the Fourth Crusade, and his death would come shortly after that. But luckily for Blanche, they did consummate their marriage, and 6 days after Count Theobald's untimely demise, his only son would be born and named Theobald IV. Blanche would remain the regent for 21 years, despite multiple wars fought over the inheritance of Champagne. Thanks to some real politicking by his mother, Theobald would one day become count. While Blanche was the practical ruler of Champagne, there was little she could do to assist her brother in Navarre, besides send some of the country's abundant wealth. With Navarre in imminent danger, King Sancho the Strong concocted a plan so crazy it might just work. He divorced his wife, ending the Toulousian alliance, which would have become useless in a few years with the Albigensian Crusade anyways. Then, he gathered a retinue of his most battle-hardened knights, gave the defense of Navarre over to his lead general, and just left. Sancho went south like a terrible and tall specter. The King of Navarre cut a hole through Castile and Aragon before coming out on the other side, in the lands of the Almohad Caliphate. The Almohads had just agreed to a 10-year truce with Castile, but Caliph Al-Mansur had just passed away and left Marrakesh to his 17-year-old son, Al-Nasir. King Sancho made the biggest gamble of his life and traveled all the way to Marrakesh, offering his sword in service to Christian Spain's public enemy number one. Al-Nasir, who surely hadn't seen a man as tall as Sancho before, entertained the idea of alliance for some sort of service. On a side note, some unreliable and non-contemporary sources say King Sancho received an Almohad princess, but I find this to be highly unlikely. Sancho likely joined the Almohad campaign on their most embittered foe, the similarly named Fallen from Grace, Almoravid Caliphate. They had fled to the Balearic Islands as the Almohads had took their lands. From Majorca, they started reconquering parts of Tunisia and Algeria, and only started growing in power. When the young and yet-to-be-tested Al-Nasir came to rule, the Almoravids decided the time to strike was now. In one way or another, Sancho likely met this invasion, and I see no one better to intimidate your rivals than the 7-3 Christian mountain king who was in the midst of a war with Aragon and Castile. But this military expedition is historical speculation. We really have no idea what Sancho the Strong did in the service of Al-Nasir. All we do know for a fact is he stayed in the Almohad Caliphate under the service of Al-Nasir for 2 years, from 1199 to 1201. King Sancho was likely only rewarded monetarily as a common mercenary, but the alliance he so desperately needed appeared not to have been granted, at least in the measure he had hoped. Sancho then took boat to Aragon, where he snuck through the countryside with his entourage, and arrived in what was left of Navarre. Those left to defend had done their job impressively well, holding the front with Aragon in its entirety. The Castilian front had collapsed, however, and they had firmly occupied Navarre's three most western provinces, including the vital Biscay, which connected Navarre to the rest of the world by access to the ocean. Much of the native Basque inhabited land was now gone, along with a large portion of Sancho's power base. Upon his arrival, a truce was called, although a treaty officially ceding these lands to Castile was not made until 1207. While it appeared there were no clear signs of alliance between King Sancho and the Almohads, there is one reason to believe that at least temporarily, there was a friendship or secret alliance between these rulers. Shortly after his return from Africa, Sancho responded to a letter from King John of England, who was seeking to renew their alliance. Sancho proclaimed that he would honor the alliance and attack all men but the King of the Moroccans, aka Caliph al-Nasir. I wonder why. Seems like some sort of an alliance or truce. Sometime presumably before 1203, King Sancho took his second wife. We really have no idea who she was, but this sculpture of both of them survives, to at least paint somewhat of a picture. I don't think she particularly looks like she would be the daughter of a caliph. My speculation has led me to believe that she was likely the daughter of a French or English Gascon noble, and possibly, if English, the ruler of the region directly bordering Navarre to the north. If true, this marriage gave Navarre that much more influence north of the Pyrenees Mountains. It is recorded that a few towns submitted to Navarre in this same time. I see no reason not to connect this unknown marriage and out-of-place submission as one. The ensuing years were rather peaceful for Sancho and Navarre as a whole. The king, possibly with monetary support from the Almohads, started the construction of an ornate Gothic-style bridge across the Ebro River. Among other architectural accomplishments, in Pamplona he added extensively to the cathedral Sancho the Wise had started building. Sancho VII wouldn't finish it either, his successor would, but he surely contributed the most to this place of worship. In this time, Sancho and his second wife had one child, a boy whose real name has been lost to time. We do know his nickname was Pumpkin, probably in connection to the literal gigantic head he inherited from his father. Pumpkin made it past childhood, and it appeared that the Jimenez family could linger on under him. But at the age of 15, he fell from his horse and split his big pumpkin head open and died. The proving moment in the life of Sancho the Strong, the action that would redeem him in the eyes of his Catholic neighbors, did not occur until 1212. The 10-year truce had ended, and now al-Nasir attacked the Kingdom of Castile, threatening to restore Al-Andalus and attack as far as France. With the fate of Iberia, and if fulfilled, all of Western Europe on the line, Pope Innocent III called for a crusade. All the kings of Christian Iberia joined him, barring Navarre, along with knightly orders like the Templars and the brave Knights of Santiago. King Sancho was the last king to join this crusade. Confirming his excommunication would be revoked, he arrived fashionably late, as usual, and joined the now 1,500-strong Crusader coalition at Toledo. When the armies met at Las Navas de Tolosa, the Almohads outnumbered them nearly 2-1. The Spanish chose to align themselves in a wedge formation with all the kings and their cavalry in the back, stretching past the flanks of the first line. The knightly orders took the front. Sancho the Strong protected the far right flank. Al-Nasir took his position on the top of a hill surrounded by infantry. Ahead of him was his cavalry on either flank, and his infantry in the middle. The battle started with a cavalry skirmish until the horses of the Caliphate were pushed back. Then the Christian infantry charged from the center and was in turn pushed back by the Moroccan infantry's counteroffensive. This prompted Alfonso to charge all the reserve cavalry, including himself and Sancho the Strong. The front line in front of Sancho hadn't been broken as badly as the one in front of Alfonso, which was on the verge of collapse. Being the only free unit left to roam the battlefield, the 55-year-old giant decided to prove once and for all who the strongest king in history was. He took his Navarrese knights, who had seen combat all across Iberia and the Maghreb, and smashed them uphill and into the bodyguard of the boy he was once forced to serve. One of his swiftest knights, with a swing of his sword, split the chain that guarded the caliph's semi-fortified camp. The Knights of Navarre stormed through this gap. Surely, Al-Nasir would have caught a glimpse of the giant man who he now regretted treating like a common mercenary. Soon enough, the caliph retreated, and his bodyguard followed. The Muslim army lost heart and began to waver in some rout. King Sancho had single-handedly won the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa and saved Iberia. Nobody asked the King of Navarre to go on a suicide mission. He did it for glory alone. This battle marks the turning point in the Iberian Reconquista. Almohad power was practically broken, but not yet expelled, and it was all because of Sancho the Strong. After this, no one dared mess with the giant King of Navarre. He was well respected in Iberia, as was his kingdom on the world stage for years to come. Soon after the battle, King Sancho would change the coat of arms of Navarre. Replacing the eagle would be a shield of chains, symbolizing the glorifying moment of King Sancho the Strong's incredible and larger-than-life existence. There is yet another theory that these chains also represent the Basque symbol for death, thought to symbolize the climactic end to the House of Jimenez. The rest of Sancho's story is a rather quiet one, but one can fill in mundane details about his life through his impressive library. These books, notes, and letters were compiled by Sancho the Wise, but his son certainly added to it. Featuring letters from 3 separate kings of England, multiple Iberian monarchs, France's most powerful counts, the refined courts his sisters were members of, and Almohad caliphs, among others. This impressive collection also gives us details about the laws and governance of Navarre. When talking about convivencia, or the historical theory that medieval Iberia was an especially religiously tolerant place, King Sancho's Navarre may actually fit that bill pretty well. In contrast to nearly everywhere else in Western Europe since the start of the Crusades, the Jewish population was treated incredibly fairly, and practically on equal grounds with Christians. The trade and money lending Jewish aristocrats brought with them was an integral part of this micronation's economy. Sometime in the late 1220s, Sancho was nearing his 70th birthday, an accomplishment for anyone of this height even today, especially if he did have gigantism. While his body seemed to be keeping up, the veins and blood flow in his long legs were not. Likely from years spent in the saddle of a small horse that just didn't fit quite right, Sancho the Strong developed a varicose ulcer on his right leg that never went away. His small heart couldn't pump all the blood he needed to heal this open ulcer, and his leg soon became near immobile. Personally, I would have cut that shit off to add more to my badass reputation, but hey. Instead, King Sancho invited his sister Blanche back to Navarre and retired, leaving her in charge of the country while Sancho was officially still the king. Blanche had experience running Champagne, so this was a sound idea. Plus, it aligned perfectly with the succession. Barring any freak pregnancies from his elderly sister, Berengaria, Count Theobald IV of Champagne was to inherit the faraway Kingdom of Navarre. This status quo continued as Sancho VII took his long-awaited break. The king, not able to move as well as his younger days, and still as hungry as a 7'3" man, kinda let himself go and became very obese. Unfortunately, in 1229, his sister Blanche passed away, thus forcing Sancho back into governance, although he still took on a relaxed role, as his nobles took on the burdens of the ailing once-strong king. A year later, his other sister, Berengaria, also died. Sancho VII was now the last living member of the Ximenes dynasty. And what a way to go out for the kings that ruled most of Iberia for the past 400 years and nearly the entire course of the Reconquista. In 1231, King Sancho was given an offer that he really had to ponder. The King of Aragon, the 23-year-old James the Conqueror, offered the crown of Aragon if he died before the 74-year-old King Sancho, and of course the more likely vice versa. There was something to be had in this deal. Allowing Aragon to absorb Navarre would further unify the Iberian Peninsula, and Aragon had already controlled Navarre for 50 years before the rise of Sancho's grandfather. King Sancho didn't sign this proposal. Pamplona, Navarre, and the Basque had always had an independent streak with all its neighbors since the days of Charlemagne. Now gone full circle, in 1234, King Sancho the Strong passed away at the miraculous age of 77, likely dying from an infection on his right leg ulcer. The crown of Navarre would be passed on to his French nephew, and generations later, Navarre would be incorporated into the French crown. And that is how history's tallest king single-handedly changed the tides of the Reconquista. I, for one, can see many parallels to draw here between him and El Cid. Now I know a lot of you just went, oh no. El Cid is way cooler, way better, way stronger. So please tell me in the comments, who would you rather face on the battlefield? If you'd like to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and join Derek Clark, Savaclio Nazarian, Taj Guilford, Nick Mate-Vossian, Lazarus Dykos, Dave J, Dalinar, and Moist Lord. Or become a YouTube channel member, like Derek Clark again, Donald Vincent, what? Why? Nick Mate-Vossian again, God, Heath Hothead 9 Dion, Carl Cleric 61 Brandian, and GOK. Thank you guys for supporting the channel. I really appreciate it.